Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to join us in the continuing conversation on the early days of FEMA-funded research from the Fire Prevention and Safety Grant Program. We will wait a minute to see if we gather some other participants, and then we'll start with today's presentations. Okay, with that, today we have Dr. Lori Moore-Merrell, the U.S. Fire Administrator, and Dr. Suzy Gulliver, who is from the Warrior Institute and has done a tremendous amount of research in behavioral health in the fire service. These presentations started with a one-day seminar at the Fire Department Safety Officers Conference in January of 23 that was called Nerdstock. And the idea was how do we trace back to the early times of what the fire service research needs were and how that important work led to future work and what are the needs today. And started with the very, very basic, what was the first FEMA funded research when the Fire Prevention and Safety R&D program started. And it shouldn't surprise anybody, and I'll brag on her for a little bit, that Dr. Lori Moore-Merrell is the only researcher left involved in the fire service today that was one of the original funded researchers. So Dr. Lori, thank you for your persistence and your engagement through your entire fire service career to elevate what we do. And with that, I will hand it off to you to talk about why fireground staffing matters.
Excellent. Thank you so much, John. And hello to Suzy. And really glad to see both of you and excited to be here as part of this presentation, because as anyone who's watching this knows, our challenge with science is to make sure that we can get the information from the project, from the research, translated into practice in the fire station or on the fire ground or wherever it might be the most relevant. And so we continue to have that challenge, and that's why this is so important. And what Nerdstock is doing, what Science Alliance is doing, and Science to the Station is so important. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to assume that that is coming through for everyone. And so as John said, why crew size matters. This was one of the original research grants that was awarded back in 2005. We started out with a collaborative team. That's still the way I operate today as the fire administrator. I think collaboration is absolutely key across the whole of the fire service. And so the studies that we did beginning in 2005 and going all the way through to 2010, 2011, even up to 2013, we were still doing research in this space and adding knowledge to the knowledge base of firefighters and helping them understand how to talk about crew size within your own department. And so one of the things about crew size and why it matters is that it has everything to do with the health and safety of firefighters who are responding. It has everything to do with the health and well-being of the occupants of any structure and making sure that they can get themselves out or can be rescued by firefighters. It has everything to do with the amount of property loss from a structure fire. And so these things are all interconnected, and that's why what we were able to do matters so much and still carries forward today. So these are the three studies that have been done. The fireground reports, the original was the residential fireground experiments that were conducted in collaboration with NIST. I hope that many that are watching this have seen the NIST report. If you haven't, you should get it, because this is your very basis for applying for a safer grant. It's the very basis for understanding your risk environment and the environment in which most fire fatalities that occur in the US today take place in that residential environment. And so this is critical. It's where the majority of firefighters that are injured on the fire ground are injured in this structure type. And so the residential fire ground is really the bread and butter of understanding fire response and the fire risk environment. And so in that low risk environment, the other was the high rise fire ground report, where we worked within a 13-story building, setting the fire on the 10th floor for response. And in this particular fire, we were able to look at and assess crew size, but also an effective response force concept. something that's becoming more and more familiar using that type, that vernacular, right, around assembling fire resources from multiple stations and having them come together and act as a single unit to intervene in the risk event. And so this looks more about those types of responses, and we're going to come back around and show you some of the results in just a moment. The third is the effect of crew size on health and safety. And so we were able to work with some of the other research colleagues, Steve Kerber at UL, Gavin Horn at UL, and Sarah Jenke at NDRI, to be able to look at, and Denise Smith at Skidmore, to be able to look at how does this all fit together? How do we take the research that each of us has done and start to pull together the concepts around crew size and how it impacts health and safety, and what are the dynamics of the fire ground that impact that as well. So let's take a look. On the residential fire ground report, what was our experiment objective? And we did go to field experiments. We did have live fire. We did have firefighters who were deployed from 13 different departments who assisted in both the residential and high-rise experiments. And so these were conducted as multi-unit drills as part of the training cadre. And so we were able to enlist firefighters who were also learning as we were going here about working together and working with various crew sizes and how that really does impact their capability to have an effect on scene. And so we looked at time to task for 2, 3, 4, and 5-person crews. And this is the first experiment that really puts science behind what you may know as the NFPA 1710 standard. And so that 1710 standard has become our bread and butter really for understanding the operational aspects of crews and firefighters on the fire ground, that time to task element of what are the tasks that have to be completed and how many people are the minimum to complete those tasks. And so some of the things that we learned here in looking at the intervention times, and some may be thinking, well, you know, this makes sense. That's common sense. Yes, it may be. But now we have the science as well to understand. And when you explain to your decision makers, it's not you just using rhetoric or just because I said so. It's important that we have the science to support what we know already in the fire service. And so this is exactly how the science played out. In that we staggered the arrival as well as the crew size. And so everything else was held constant. The fire size, the fire environment, the fire location, everything else, every other variable had to be held constant so we could understand the differences between the arrival of a 2-person crew or a series of 2-person crews, whether or not they were being dispatched from closer or further away. These were the concepts that we looked at, and you can begin to see the difference that crew size has on when they released, or the megawatts of the fire, how large the fire was when they were there and able to intervene. Obviously, the 4 and 5 early had better results. They were able to get there earlier when the fire was still small enough to intervene often before we reached flashover. And so we can see that in a different graph here. You begin to see the assembly of firefighters, and from where geographically they originated mattered as well. So station location became part of the conversation here as well. And then we moved to the high-rise fire experiments, and the field experiments here were a little bit different, where we began to look at not just crew size, but that effective response force that is critical here, because based on crew size and assembly and where, again, geographically, your fire crews, your companies are originating and how quickly they can come together. So often when we look at this, we look at assembling for a low hazard. This is where you get that 15 number from. And if you're going to operate an aerial, that goes to 17, right, as that baseline crew or effective response force. And then you have for medium hazard or that strip mall, we're looking at much larger numbers, 28 as your baseline plus your ALS crews. And then in this, we were able to substantiate that a baseline here is 42, including 2 ALS units. And so you'll see that play out, and these numbers now are recorded also in the 1710 standard. And so everything we did about the crew size and deployment configuration, we're always operating around 3 criteria of safe, efficient, and effective. And that is our description and our performance metrics really around crew size and assembly of crews on scene. And so we had various variables that we looked at in this space, but one of the more important is how quickly are we getting the fire out? How quickly are we getting water on the fire? And so you'll see here just from this graph, just at a visual, first in, just bite in time, you can already see that a 6-person crew was able not only to start earlier because they were able to assemble that effective response force, but their duration to get in there and get the fire out, right, was much smaller. So the box that you see on the graph is a much smaller box. You'll also see the intervention times of the 5-person crew and 4, very close, but still the 5 are assembling and getting in there much quicker. And so you begin to see some of the impact overall on their capability to change the risk environment. You can look here at search and rescue. So if there are trapped occupants, and for the experiments, we had trapped occupants, they were held constant in the exact same place so that each crew size, we could see how quickly they searched the rooms, the search patterns, and what had to take place. And it was very much driven, once again, by assembling enough people on scene to be able to start, because we have to have crews of we have to have 2 people in these search crews. They go in as companies, and so we have to assemble enough to not only start the fire attack, but to start search and rescue. And so this is why that assembly of that effective response force is so important. And so you can see the 6-person crews started a little bit earlier than the 5s, but the 5s were very effective. The duration for completing the search, again, this is sort of one of those like, okay, this makes perfect sense. It's sort of common sense. More people, you get done faster. Yes, but now we also have the science, and you can see more hands got the work done. And for the trapped occupants, this makes a lot of sense to have larger crews intervene early, get the job done quickly. But I want you to think for a moment about what this meant for the firefighters engaged inside a toxic environment. If you're operating in a heavy smoke-filled environment doing search and rescue, do you want to be in there in a shorter time period of the 5-person crew or the longer time period of the 3-person crew? What's that doing to your exposure and your dosage inside that environment? And so thinking through the real ramifications of what's happening on scene. So these 3 slides, I'm just going to show you. This is a 3-person crew, and I want you to look at the length of the bars. And so these were some of the times to task, who was doing the task. And so you have establishment of the RIT teams, you've got, fire attack, we've got rescue, all the different assignments, including advancing the attack line. You see those down the left-hand side. This is a 3-person crew, but just watch the length of the bars, because this is a 4-person crew and this is a 5-person crew. And so again, completing each of these tasks, a much shorter duration, more hands, less work. And so our overall exposure of the firefighters on the fire ground also lessened in these scenarios. And so it matters to understand all of the implications of crew size. And so what did we do? Well, out of the conclusions of the high-rise study, we were able to denote that larger fires expose firefighters to greater risk and more challenges to suppress. So the earlier the intervention, the earlier we can assemble crews to get inside, get water on the fire, reduce the risk, then the less exposure for our firefighters. 3-person crews ascending to the fire floor confronted an environment that released 60% more heat energy than those that were encountered by larger crews. That matters because the fire is growing while we're assembling, right, to go and intervene. So how much did it grow, and what were the greater risks to our firefighters once they made entry? Larger fires also have greater risk for exposure of building occupants. And so we were able to see that the faster our our rescue crews got to the occupants for rescue, the lower the dose of toxins that those occupants were exposed to. And so again, a common sense sort of understanding, but having the science to define what portions of the population are going to get that fractional effective dose of those toxins based on how long they are there waiting for rescue. If they cannot self-evacuate, That matters. And who can we save and who can we not save? Who will succumb to those toxins in the smoke before we can arrive? And we saw this actually play out in the Bronx fire in January of 2022, where those who died in the upper floors and in the stairwells of the upper floors long before our firefighters could even get in there and get them. And that had everything to do with the failure of our buildings. What happens to some of the buildings long before firefighters arrive? But that exposure matters. So even sometimes the best performing fire departments like FDNY, for example, they got there fast. They were there in minutes. We still see buildings fail the occupants long before firefighters can even assemble and get to them. But these crew sizes matter. And it matters for that risk environment and getting there quickly, because they were able to save a great number as well, because they did get in there. They got them out quickly. The numbers were just too great. Properly engineered fire and operational sprinkler systems drastically reduce risk exposure. That was an absolute finding from these experiments. Sprinklers make things better. Sprinklers reduce the risk so that the risk environment that firefighters are entering is much lesser, both from a heat energy release and a smoke or toxin release for that environment. So what was the third thing that I told you about? Well, that's the paper that we put together by combining not only the research I just told you about, but taking a look at what Denise Smith has done in the health and safety environment for cardiac effects on firefighters working on the fire ground, looking at their overall toxic exposure, both to thermal insults and some of the other things that firefighters experience on the fire ground. And then also taking a look at what Steve Kerber has done in the UL environment and the fire dynamics of what is happening to the fire. How is it moving? How is it flowing through the building? What is the heat release and the smoke release? And so once we began to, and I've already addressed some of this as I've been talking, but once we began to put together science from different scientists and linking these findings together somehow to create policy so that we can help decision makers understand, that's important as well. And so we did that and prepared more of a policy paper on looking at the health and safety risk of firefighters and what they face during their work activities and in different settings, like the residential, what we consider a low hazard event, and then the high rise, where we consider it a much more high risk, high hazard event, and the effects of crew size and how that matters. Well, once we look at that directly in the scope of the work of the firefighters themselves, then understanding that these risks are directly related to the work also the firefighters are performing. You saw that the duration that the firefighters who came in with smaller crew sizes, they had to work longer, which means what? Well, if I'm on search and rescue and I'm crawling around, means my heart rate is going to go up and it's going to be sustained at a higher level for a much longer period of time. And so that kind of work changes the outcome for some firefighters. So we have to understand the oxygen consumption, all of those things matter in that work environment, and it has everything to do too with crew size. So making sure that we're having that work coordinated on scene mattered. We need enough people on scene to assemble that effective response force so that I can have the coordinated activities. We want ventilation in coordination with water on fire, not one and then the other, right? We want to make sure that we're coordinating activities and having them done concurrently or simultaneously, having them done simultaneously, not concurrently one after the other. There are things that should be coordinated and interdependent. And then having simultaneously these activities, as it notes, in an efficient manner so that we can limit the fire growth and stop the escalating risk. So this is a graphic that was actually created by UL based on some of the descriptions that we have and the crew sizes. And so this one, I think, is a very well done schematic of our minimum response, which is 4-person crews. If we deploy 4-person crews, baseline minimum, then that becomes the floor of our residential fire ground. Anything less than that is less than what is seen in science as being appropriate, safe, efficient, and effective And it's also a lesson is written into the NFPA 1710 standard. So you can begin to see where each of the firefighters are. We see the search and rescue happening up in the second story here with the trucks, truck crew. We see the attack lines operating on the second floor. We see ventilation happening with 2 members of the truck crew as well. You also see the RIT team assembled over on the far left, and you see that second or the backup line ready at the front door. And you also see our pump operators. You see the chief on scene. All of these pieces, you see the tasks that have to be done and the key for coordination. This is what right looks like. And that's what we want to be able to communicate to decision makers. So what are some of the health and safety impacts? Well, on firefighting, you know, all of the tasks that have to be done. And so looking at those tasks and what are the impact on the actual workers doing those tasks, on the firefighters doing those tasks, and what are the possibility of outcomes there? Everything from trauma to burns to cardiac events to fatigue. And all of that gets worse as we have them working in higher risk environments. So more fire growth is not a good scenario. That's why we need them assembled early, and we need them to be able to have an effective response force to coordinate that fire attack from the outside and then interior. And so we want to reduce the strain, and we know that crew size and assembling an effective response force matters. And so looking at the number of personnel and how that directly influences not only your operational effectiveness on scene, being able to coordinate that activity, stop the risk escalation, but also significant effects on firefighter health and safety. So crew size does matter, and it matters a lot. Crew size and those effective response forces. Again, our recommendation by combining all of our research into a policy-driven paper says that the minimum is 4-person crews in that low hazard environment. And then if you have additional challenges, whether it is medium hazard or high hazard, restricted geographical capability to get assembly of fire crews there, to get your fire crews there in a timely manner. If you have other challenges, then you need to beef up those baseline crews to have 5 or 6 personnel because people aren't coming. You don't have more crews coming in a timely manner. So understanding what's in the standard and how it applies and how it is science driven, very important. And then whenever possible, understanding that you can have risk escalation and that if you see fire growth or you see that we're operating in an extreme heat environment, if you see other challenges beyond the fire itself, then decision makers on scene, our incident commanders, have to be prepared to add resources early. Don't get behind the curve. Understand what's happening in the occupational exposure as well as the risk escalation that can take place on an evolving fire ground and make decisions early. So with that, John, I'm going to hand it back to you. John, you're muted, I think.
Oh, that always works better. Thank you. Is certainly one of the biggest takeaways from that conversation is the fact-based, research-based, data-based answer to why and how come that local fire chiefs and fire service leaders get from their local elected officials every, at budget time, at any time there's a conversation about how we provide service delivery, the question of, well, why do you do it that way? What does it mean? How do we do that? Is really the keys to being able to answer those questions are contained in those reports. So certainly, fantastic stuff to have. In light of what we see in the changes in the built environment today in 2023 and the original experiment being 13 years ago, do you envision a need to respond to the challenges in the built environment, whether it's from e-mobility devices, stored energy systems, or just simply what's in our dwellings and places that we live and work today that might change that in any way?
John, that's a great question. And I think that one of the things we have to remember, and I hear it from my colleagues at UL often, is that fire is fast. We all need to understand fire is fast. And your likelihood of dying in a fire and this is occupants, your likelihood of dying in a fire are greater today than they were 40 years ago. That speaks volumes to me. And we're often asked why. Why is that the case? Well, it has everything to do with the things in our home. It has to do with the lightweight construction, that we're not using ignition resistant building materials in the interface of the wildland. We're not using hardwoods as much as we used to. We're using fabric, we're using foam, we're using plastics. And our homes are full of those things, and they're highly flammable. And so fire is fast, and a lot of it is being driven by our own choices and how we're building and how we are furnishing our homes. And you can just watch, commercials, and I see them sometimes for this lightweight furniture, and you can, move it around and reassemble it. It's like Legos, somehow. And I'm just like, oh my goodness, if that catches on fire, one candle turn over and we're done, right? Your egress is cut off, everything. So these things are the things that I worry about. But yes, based on that, John, I think that there might be an opportunity for us to assess, has our response environment changed so substantially, given this, what we've talked about, given the introduction of technologies and innovations that have become new ignition sources. I think we might have to revisit and look at several things, not just the crew size and the assembly, but the methods of explosiveness now we're seeing in lithium-ion batteries. We certainly don't want, we don't want occupants experiencing it, but we don't want firefighters experiencing it either. And so reading the event when we arrive is going to be key. Understanding how to deploy your people on scene is going to be key. Being very situationally aware, to me, is so important that I think that would come before rerunning the crew size, because I think the crew size studies are solid, but I would continuously revisit and say, have things changed enough? Has our risk environment changed enough that we need to reassess? I think there are some priorities in front of this, but yes, this would be in line.
And I think it dovetails well with the context of all of it. Is we get so stuck on the idea of fighting fire that in many ways we don't fight fire, we fight time. And unfortunately that period of time where we can intervene to make a difference continues to shrink in many places. And unfortunately we don't have the capability to respond to that. So thank you very much for it. And again, for anybody that hasn't looked at it, you're missing a tremendous opportunity to add context and data and knowledge to your discussions in your local communities about how to make your fire service better and meet the needs of your citizens. And don't say, well, I don't have a high-rise building or my private dwellings don't look. It's the math and the science is sound and it's generalizable across the entire United States Fire Service. So all 3 publications are available. All 3 are priced at the firefighter friendly price of free. So you can grab them and you should, download them, print them out, take a look at them today. So Dr. Lori, thank you for fitting us into your epically busy schedule, and I appreciate what you continue to contribute.
Thank you, John. Thanks for having me.
So
awesome.
I have a question, actually, or
a
comment.
I did miss your raised hand.
Yeah, so I'll lower my hand now. My comment is this. I didn't put these things together when I saw you back in January, Dr. Lori, but we have a large survey of the stressors on fire service. We have over 8,000 responses, and we were expecting that overtime and shifts would be related to all our behavioral health outcomes. No, it's crew size.
Yes.
Crew size for firefighters drives up, or understaffing actually is what it is, drives up job dissatisfaction, burnout, and PTSD, depression, etc. We're still in early phases of data analysis because it's a massive data set, but I think this is one of those examples where the science for why we should be interested has been done by your group, and now we're seeing that in a smaller place, firefighters in a smaller way, not an experimentally controlled study like your series of studies, but in a self-report kind of what bothers me way, what we see as a driver for bad outcomes is crew size being.
You know, Suzy, I am
So
not,
that's,
I
I mean,
guess,
that's a wonderful connection and speaks to the collaborativeness and necessity of scientists across disciplines working together and being brought together into forums like this.
I love that. And I'm not surprised in that I know one of the stressors that can lead to the post-traumatic is not feeling support of your leadership. And this crew size is a direct reflection of not feeling support. You can't get leadership to say, I need more, or to fight for you to have the minimum.
Right.
What we know from science should be the minimum. They're asking you to do more and putting yourself at greater risk, even than your risk environment, because
Right.
you don't have enough. And I think that I think that's the connection, if I'm not mistaken.
I think the other piece of it too is you think about how firefighters are wired as very can-do people. Like we're high-speed, low-drag, hard charging. Like we're going to fix the universe. And when we rub up against something that, if I'd had an extra set of hands or another company or another person that I know in my heart as a firefighter that's been doing it for a long time, the outcome would have been better. That impact is, and again, directly tied to crew size. That, geez, if I'd had one more line, or if I had one more person on the line, or we could have got the civilian out of the building fast enough, would have had a better, more positive feeling outcome than what we walked into it knowing that we were down a company, down a member, whatever, that prolonged the event in a way that added that stress. So fascinating, without a doubt. So with that, we will translate. That's a great segue, Dr. Gulliver, into your work on behavioral health. So let's start down that road.
Okay, well, here we go. I think. Yeah. Are we there?
You are 100%.
Okay, so I titled my talk "Impact of FEMA Funding on Behavioral Health Issues," and I've got some slides here. I want to preface this by saying that one of the beauties of the meeting in January is that it brought the whole world of people interested in fire science together, even if they were particularly invested in one part of fire service. And so, Sarah called it Nerdstock, and I led my talk with a reference to what Nerdstock was a reference to, which describes really well for me as a clinical psychologist what it was like when I started working with fire service some 20 years ago. I did not have this clip at the original meeting, but I have it now, and I think it's worth sharing just because it will bring us a smile. So here we go.
Meanest, ugliest, nastiest one, the meanest father raper of them all, was coming over to me, and he was mean and ugly and nasty and horrible and all kinds of things. And he sat down next to me and said, "Kid, what you get?" Said, "I didn't get nothing. I had to pay $50 and pick up the garbage." Said, "What were you arrested for, kid?" And I said, "Littering." And they all moved away from me on the bench there, the carry on phone, all kinds of mean, nasty things, till I said, "And creating a nuisance." And they all came back, shook my hand, and we had a great time on the bench talking about crime, mother, stem, father, race, and all kinds of groovy things that we was talking about on the bench.
So the point here is that when a clinical psychologist shows up in the fire station 20 plus years ago, everybody moves away from her on the bench. But when you say, hey, I want to create a disturbance about the stressors of your job, you all are remarkably resilient human beings and doing much better than you should be given the stress load. And I would like to understand that so I can help other people. Then they all moved back. And the work that I was able to do with the assistance of grants from FEMA have really resulted in a synergy and a movement forward on how to handle stress, and also what to do about behavioral health issues that become inevitable if you're not able to build some different kinds of intervention and resilience. So I'm going to run through the different projects that I've been fortunate to be involved in. These 6 grants are the grants that were that came to me as principal investigator. The first one, which was done in fiscal year 2007, was a Project Prevent. Project Prevent did 20 cities worth of focus groups, co-led by a firefighter and a clinical psychologist. Each of these focus groups assessed what are the barriers to behavioral health, what are the possible solutions to behavioral health, and from that exhaustive focus group or stakeholder meeting venue, we developed a survey that went out and was responded to by about 2,200 firefighters, another 250 volunteer firefighters. And that established that our biggest barrier to behavioral health in fire service was the construct of stigma. A secondary barrier was whether clinicians were culturally aware and culturally savvy enough to be effective in forming a bond when somebody needed help. And then a good indication that firefighters were hungry for skills when they identified that somebody was in trouble to get them to a level of care. So Project Prevent resulted really in all the other grants that came from there. The next one was Reach Out. Reach Out was our R&D study, and we adapted motivational interviewing, which is a standard of care for addiction, but we adapted it to peers, trained peers in doing motivational interviewing skills with firefighters in need of additional help, and demonstrated that after people had completed that training, they were more likely to do an outreach, and they also evaluated the success of that outreach as much higher. Interestingly enough, in that study, we demonstrated that our canned version of the training, the one that was captured in video, was more consistently effective than live trainings, which is a little finding, but something when you think about trying to make sure that you're developing a product that will help people across rural environments, across underfunded urban environments, et cetera. It's nice to know that that live training may not be quite as effective as standardized canned training. Next project that we did was the Suicide Standard Operating Procedure Project. This was because in the behavioral health literature, we knew that postvention following the suicide was effective in decreasing other suicides. There's some data that argue, not particularly conclusively, by the way, but at least give you a pause for worry that when one suicide happens, there can be clusters of suicides that follow. And in the suicide researchers say that if you do a postvention, you decrease that chance. And there are a couple studies of factory environments, actually, wherein suicide postventions have been demonstrated to be effective. So we were able, with the help of this grant, to go out and do focus groups across different kinds of departments to develop a template for suicide postvention, and to write a white paper and a manuscript that was disseminable, saying that every department should have a plan in place for a postvention after a firefighter dies by suicide. that project led into the Stamp Out Stigma project. One of the things that was particularly encouraging in the Stamp Out Stigma project is going back to Arlo and the early days of research in behavioral health with fire service. I was not sure that we would have a groundswell of response of people who wanted to tell their behavioral health story. So Stamp Out Stigma was a project wherein we asked firefighters through multiple channels who had struggled with a behavioral health condition, that they sought treatment or care and that they were able to recover from that problem, to tell their story that would be captured on video and included in a Stamp Out Stigma curriculum that was developed with my fire service team. We had over 200 firefighters throw their hand in the air and say, yeah, I'm willing to tell my story and have it be live in perpetuity. That to me right there tells me how much from the days of Project Prevent to the days of Stamp Out Stigma, how much motion had happened. But because I believe that, and I was actually astonished when I dove into this literature, I believe that testimonials can be potentially iatrogenic. A bad testimonial might move people in the wrong direction. So we were very rigorous in this project in that we videotaped. First, we did a clinical interviewing procedure wherein we determined that people were stable enough and well enough in their recovery to be videotaped, that we felt ethically that it was okay. And then we videotaped 12 people and we subjected them to evaluations, determining whether if you watched 3 of these videos, whether your stigma went in the right direction. And then we embedded the top 3 and subjected the curriculum with the top 3 to beta tests before we rolled it out nationally. And that curriculum is available again on our website, and the actual testimonials can be taken out and used in an intervention style, perhaps by a senior peer support person who detects that a particular house has a lot of stigma. So it's a really handy training tool. Project Access is the project that was originally designed. The VA has huge data on whether telehealth for behavioral health issues is as effective as face-to-face treatment. I wasn't sure that those data would hold in a fire service population. I also wanted there to be a transdiagnostic treatment available that had been culturally adapted, with the idea that we could maybe bump up the number of clinicians that are available who can do treatment with fire service in the cases that people want it. And so pre-COVID, we were funded to pilot test telemental health in firefighters. We gave people the option of face-to-face or telehealth. And we, in that study, we only had one person say, yeah, I want to do face-to-face. He came into the office, he looked around the whole office, he had his session, and then he said to his therapist, now that I know you guys are legit, I'm going to do the online thing. So the other interesting sort of side effect of Project Access, we demonstrated medium to large effect sizes for PTSD, depression, alcohol use. They held at 1 month. So to my knowledge, this is the only study of a trans-theoretical, culturally sensitive treatment program delivered via telehealth for firefighters. But then COVID happened. And the really great thing about COVID, not that COVID was great for any of us, but it allowed us to open the doors to continue to do telehealth across state lines. And so we had during COVID, and actually we just stopped enrolling yesterday. So all the data from this are not available yet, but we have treated between Project Access and Access Pro Bono, we've treated around 160 firefighters free of charge with an evidence-based treatment. Our dropout is next to nothing, and our retention rates at the 1 month follow-up is about 78%, 79%. The findings from Project Access were replicated in Access Pro Bono. So in that, we demonstrated not only that this treatment works and that it's effective via telehealth, but that you can do it safely across state lines, and that the treatment benefits hold at 1 month. So that allowed us to do some rigorous science around treatment. We're currently applying for other projects to try to add other types of therapy to this this treatment program, and we'll have the evaluation piece as stringent around it as it can be. ER for ER is the project that we're just wrapping up from our FEMA funding. We're basically just polishing it. This is, and I think this is very important when you think about the gaps in quality of care, and I'll say a little bit more about this in my conclusions, but ER for ER took 4 of the skills that are taught in the unified protocol, which is what we used in Project Access, and then modularized those 4 skills for peer supporters to learn how to use them so that they can either teach to people they're helping as a peer supporter, or use with their teams, or use themselves these emotion regulation skills. So ER for ER stands for emotion regulation for emergency responders. This project is, I think, the next wave of what we need to do to close the gaps for people who suffer the consequences of their occupational choice in the behavioral health arena. In addition, I've been really fortunate to be able to collaborate with the IAFF to build that standardized peer support training program. Over 8,500 US and Canadian firefighters have been trained in peer support. The training has modified over the years and now has an online component. We're just gearing up to launch an assessment of what trained peer supporters do after being trained in terms of the work that they do in the peer support arena. So that's an important piece coming online now. I participated in developing a disaster response educational program. That disaster response educational program is available on the IAFF website and is really a good orientation for what to do when you have the honor of being asked to come into a city or town that has had something befall it. I just got down from Allen. I serve frequently as a clinician. The reality is that clinicians as boots on the ground aren't really needed very much when you're in the days and weeks post-disaster. But knowing that they're available and that they get it is tremendously important. And we're trying to build other clinicians who understand that role and take it seriously. I have helped with the resilience training program that the IAFF has put out, and I've also helped with the clinician course training because we will, one of my mentors in graduate school was George Albee, who's a guy who really was brilliant. And he used to say a couple of things that are very important. The first thing he would say is that if you want to end mental illness, end poverty. The second thing that he would say that feels a little bit less disheartening is that treating people one person at a time with one clinician as a time is never going to close the gap between people who are suffering and getting them the resources to get well. And so, I think the clinician training course will bump up the number of people that we have who are trained in the culture and trained in an evidence-based practice, because there are a lot of well-intentioned people out there who are untrained and not just culturally untrained, but actually don't know how to deliver PTSD treatment, for instance. One statistic that I lose sleep over is that although we have at least 3 treatments for PTSD that work and work really well, actually, I would add the unified protocol as a 4th, and probably acceptance and commitment therapy as a 5th treatment that work really well. Less than 6% of people using their mental health resources are getting evidence-based care. So that is a stunning statistic to me. And I really think that the clinician training course might help us get people not only trained to the culture, but also thinking about what they actually know how to do. We, in collaboration with our colleagues at Duke, developed a extension of the only evidence-based suicide safety intervention to be delivered by firefighters to anyone who's suffering. Actually, Brown and Barbara, oh gosh, and I did this when I gave the talk last time, I blocked on her name, and she has passed away, but she had 4 randomized controlled trials. They developed this intervention at Columbia. Across these 4 randomized trials, she demonstrated that an effectively done suicide safety plan saved people, and it does not need to be done by a clinician. And we developed a training for our peer safety. She said when she was helping develop this program, she said that the peer supporters who were the actors and actresses in this educational development series were better than either the clinicians she was training in New York City or the actors she was paying to play clinicians in New York City. So I'm very confident that this will save lives, and it's nice to have an evidence-based tool in our toolbox to save lives, given that the numbers of suicides in fire service is, although we don't actually know what the real number is, it is enough to be very alarming. Finally, also with my colleagues at Duke, we have developed an anger management course that's just about to go live. And these are all specifically things that have been developed with the support of the FEMA funding mechanism. So overall, what do I think FEMA has accomplished or helped scientists in the field accomplish is that we know that stigma is actually declining. People are not judging fellow firefighters and also not judging themselves. Internalized stigma, as we found in Stamp Out stigma, is a much bigger barrier to asking for help than externalized stigma. Although people worry that they're going to be judged, they're actually not going to be judged. They're going to judge themselves. So that's an interesting twist on stigma, but it is getting better. Suicide will always be a conundrum for fire service in that because of the personality that John referred to today, when you lose one, it's painful, no matter how you lose them. That is part of the firefighter personality, if there is such a thing. And so we're always going to suffer when we lose someone, but now we have at least one evidence-based method that can be used by firefighters to save their own. When we think about behavioral health issues, we know that they're about as frequent and as prevalent in fire service as they are in the military. We didn't know that for sure 20 years ago, but we know it now. And the take home from that is that it's much, much higher than civilians. So even though it's not every other firefighter who has PTSD or depression or substance use, although particularly alcohol use in fire service is alarmingly high, but it's also alarmingly high in the military and in the veteran samples post-military. You're looking at PTSD being about twice what it is for civilians, about the same rate as in military combat veterans. You're looking at anxiety and depression being big drivers, again, about double, a little less than double. You're looking at 40% with alcohol use. Those are big inflated problems. We do have really good treatments for all of those problems, but people can't get them. And firefighters, especially if they bump into a clinician who's not culturally aware, who turns them off, are not going to come back for a second, third, fourth try. If you get after a problem early, it's much less likely to become chronic. That has been demonstrated across this work and outside of this work. The way that you get at a problem early is through peers and through equipping peers with some mental health and behavioral health interventions. One of the most powerful interventions available now for depression and chronic depression, which are actually two different things, is behavioral activation. Well, who better than a fellow firefighter to help you with your behavioral health, with your behavioral activation stuff? Who better to be your accountability partner than somebody who understands the job, the tensions of the job, the rewards of the job? That is far more effective, and peers are far more effective at helping people who have detected that they're at the top of a slippery slope than going to therapy once or twice a month for 50 minutes. And then finally, we know from this body of work that evidence-based culturally adapted treatment via telehealth works. And we have people, another take-home message from this, we're over time, is that we can train people across mental health disciplines to be up to criterion. So in our clinic, we train psychologists, we train social workers, we train licensed mental health counselors. And we don't see different outcomes based on degree. So, as a former hippie, I have to acknowledge my isms as part of my own recovery. And I used to think that the PhD was the most important degree, and I no longer believe that because the data made me lose an ism. So in the spirit of Nerdstock, I'll just wrap up by saying that I am delighted to be part of this group of scientists and to be part of the work that is making a difference, whether it's Nerdstock Science to the Station, et cetera. It's been wonderful. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
And I wish we could go on forever, because there's just so much there that talks about the intersections of all these different things. And you hit on something I know is a burgeoning topic and sometimes challenging, is the access to culturally competent clinicians. And I was wondering if you could just for a minute talk about how what you've seen in the evidence of telehealth has opened doors in places that perhaps didn't have access to clinicians or didn't want to use local access to clinicians, and how that's borne out in your research and the effectiveness of having telehealth as a resource where previously there was nothing.
So yeah, I think it is all of my anxiety about telehealth as a modality is gone, and it's driven away by the data. We have had to do, rarely, but we have had to do rescues, and we've done them. So people were worried about safety, and we've demonstrated that it's safe to do telehealth. We've also, I think, but with the advent of COVID, we developed competition in the marketplace, and there's a double-edged sword there. We need to get the education out that lets people know that all clinicians are not created equal, and that they really, when you're looking for help, particularly some of the inflated privacy that people feel by getting an online therapist, because there are lots of competitors in the marketplace right now. who are licensed. You can be licensed without being trained in evidence-based care, right? And when people are vulnerable, they don't necessarily have time to interview their clinician to say, hey, do you know how to do real treatment for PTSD? Or, hey, do you know how to do real treatment for depression? Or are you just gonna sit and listen to me? Which feels good, but doesn't necessarily help people get better. Right?
And I think you couple that with, when it is so hard to get firefighters to take that step to go see a clinician of whatever form for whatever reason, that something else that you touched on, that if you don't feel that it's working, or you don't feel that you're getting the care or the treatment that you feel you should, that you need in order to get better, that you need to leave, sever that relationship and find another one that will provide you with what you need in order to get better.
Right. And various, one of the things that I do and many of my behavioral health colleagues do is we have a large national network, international network of clinicians that we would refer our firefighters and our family members to. And I'm always happy to make a referral, although it's terribly time consuming, frankly. It's not, you can't just pull up Psychology Today's clinician reference. You can't just even go to a professional organization. When I make a referral, I call the clinicians and I vet them. And our peer support teams have been trained in how to vet clinicians also. That's part of the peer support training program, is how do you vet a clinician? Because they're only going to be needed a part of the time, not all of the time.
And it's certainly, I think, one of the most impactful pieces of evidence that the work that you have done and the researchers in the sphere of behavioral health have done that's important is that top bullet point in your last slide, that stigma is declining, and certainly that's something to be happy about and to continue to work, because as we reduce stigmatization of access to behavioral health care, it'll only make us better. So again, I wish we had more time. This has been incredibly insightful, incredibly important. Both topics are being absolutely outstanding, and my generation and the next generations of the fire service benefit from the work that both of you have done, and the seeds and I think the piece that perhaps neither of you take enough credit for, the seeds that you have planted in young emerging researchers to continue to pick up the mantle and to continue the good work that you've done. So Dr. Moore-Merrell, Dr. Gulliver, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
And for the contribution to NerdStock and the Science Alliance.
Thank you, John.
Take care, everybody. Happy weekend also. Bye-bye.
Happy
Thanks,
weekend.
bye.
Too. Take care. Thank you.